This training will show you how to refresh the TCC Data Dictionary in order to be able to integrate on user-defined fields, also known as UDFs. So by default, when you install the Taleo Connect client software, the data model will always show only the standard fields. So in order for us to be able to integrate on user-defined fields, you will need to do a special step that is called the data model synchronization. Just before we look at how to perform this step, here's a few notes that are important to consider before we do a demonstration. So the first thing to note is that you'll need to synchronize every combination of Taleo product and version that are currently used by your integrations if you want to be able to use user-defined fields or UDFs in them. By that, I mean that if, for example, you currently have integrations running on recruiting 15B and also on recruiting 17.4, you will need to actually refresh both data models, right? So you'll need to not only refresh one of the two, but you'll need to refresh both. So it's going to be important to know what are the different products and versions you're using if you want to be able to know which products you need and versions you need to synchronize. The second thing to consider is that when you do a synchronization, so if you look at your TCC install folder, so here in my case, my Taleo Connect client is right here. So if I open that TCC folder, you'll see that there's a subfolder called Custom Dictionaries. So that's actually where these files will be created, where the synchronized data models will be placed. And it's important to note because you'll see that from time to time, you might be requested to actually copy that file in another folder. That would apply, for example, for any client who is using the TCC touchpoint structure. So in the TCC touchpoint structure, there's also a subfolder called Custom Dictionaries. So in order to be able to use that structure, what you will need to do is synchronize your data model and then copy the file that was generated and copy it in the TCC touchpoint / custom dictionaries. So it will be important for us to know that where to find that file and also which one to grab, which is the second item that is of importance. So anytime we're going to create a new data model or synchronize a new versions of a product, the file that will be created in that folder will be prefixed with the product and version code, right? So for example, if you were to resynchronize the data model recruiting 17.4, the code for that product and version is RC1704. So the file that will be generated is actually going to be prefixed with RC1704. So that will be a good indicator of which file to copy over your TCC touchpoints, for example, if you need to resynchronize a specific version and copy it over somewhere else. So we're actually going to do a demonstration of this within TCC. So I'm actually going to go in TCC and open the user interface. So the first thing to note before you actually synchronize the data model is that whenever you do that step, you need to close every window that is currently open in TCC. So for example, if I was currently editing an export script and I would try to synchronize, I'm actually going to get a warning from TCC saying you need to close every window before you do that synchronization. So make sure that everything is closed out in TCC. And what you're going to do is actually go into that tab on the right upper corner called Product Integration Pack. You're going to select that tab. And if you look at the right side of that tab, there's a little orange icon. If I put my mouse over it, it says Synchronize Custom Fields. So that's what we'll need to click on to do that data model synchronization. When I do click on this, I'm going to be, for those of you who are familiar with TCC, you'll notice that this window looks a lot like the ping window that we see at the very beginning when you do a first login TCC. It's actually the same window. So we'll need to do a little bit the same thing as what we do when we ping, which is select a product code and version and select an endpoint, aka a zone, a Taleo zone that we want to use to do our refresh. So of course, you'll need to make sure that you select the product that you want to resynchronize. So for example, let's say I have a script written in recruiting 17.4 and I want to refresh its data model. I would go into that product and select recruiting 17.4. The endpoint, in your case, you'll probably have only your staging zone and your production zone in that window. I have more because I have many clients. But what's good to know is the Taleo zone that you're going to select, depending on what user-defined fields are created in that zone, they will be brought over into the data model. So for example, if you have a UDF that exists in staging but does not exist in production, if you want to be able to integrate on it, you need to select your staging zone as your endpoint. So once you've selected the product that you want to refresh or synchronize and the zone that you're going to use, you simply click on the Synchronize button at the lower right corner, and it's going to initiate the creation of the file. So one thing to note, this takes maybe a minute or a couple of seconds, depending on which product you select. If you want to see the progress, I'll bring your attention to the lower right corner, and it could be very small on that presentation, but you see a percentage of progress, right? At this point, it's at 43%. So once it reaches the 100% mark, that's when we should see, that file created in that folder. I'm going to put both windows like this so you can see both. So you see the progress at the bottom, 65, 69%. That's my custom dictionary folder, currently empty. But as soon as we reach 100 in the data synchronization, that file will be created in that folder here. So once it is, we're actually going to see what difference, what it did into the TCC system. So you see that the file is created, and as I mentioned earlier, the prefix RC1704 tells me what is the product and the version that was used when I refreshed that data model, right? So while I explain a little bit how this works, I'm actually going to refresh also recruiting 15B, just so that we can see that we could have multiple versions of that data model in different versions of TCC products. So the progress here is at 8%. So if you ever wonder, how to know what are the codes for each of the products and versions. So for example, how do you know that RC1704 is actually represents recruiting 17.4? There's going to be a very easy trick to do that. So I'm actually going to need to wait for the second synchronization that is going on, which is now at 56%. So once that completes, I'll show you how you can identify these codes in the system. For now, let's just know that we've refreshed 1704, and now I'm refreshing or synchronizing set 15B. So of course, once that resynchronization is completed, which is in a few seconds, it will create another file. So you see I have a new file, RC1502, which is 15B. So as I mentioned earlier, if you want to have a little trick to know how to identify a code for a specific version, all you need to do is go in TCC, do File, New, and New Export, and select the product that you're looking for. So for example, what would be the code for recruiting 13B, right? So you could select that product, select any entity, it really doesn't matter, and click Finish, so that it just creates the template for an export. So we see that the product is really recruiting 13B. And if you click on the source tab in TCC, you'll see what is the product code. So you see that the standard or the format is a bit different in older versions. So you see that this one is PRO1010. So that's actually the product code for recruiting 13B. So if I was to synchronize that data model, I would have a file that would be prefixed with that value. So let's see what it looks like actually in TCC when you have refreshed your data model. So when you've synchronized versus when you haven't synchronized. So if I was to do a new export in TCC, and let's say I'm going to actually do it on recruiting 13B, and I'm going to do a candidate export. So the first thing you'll notice is that my data model, although I just did 2 synchronization, my data model is still showing only standard field. How do I know that? By the way, it's simple. Every user-defined field in the data model will be marked with an orange icon. So if there's no orange icon in that file, as it is the case here, except these 2 that are kind of just there for information purposes, they're not real UDFs. So this means that I'm looking at a data model that was not refreshed. As opposed to if I open a new export, and this time I'll use recruiting 17.4, again, same entity, candidate, you'll notice that now it'll be a bit different. I'm going to see a little bit more fields. Every field that has an orange icon is a user-defined field. So a field that is specific to your zone that was created by either a system admin or a user in the Taleo system. So that's how you refresh your data models in TCC. Just before we actually end this presentation, there's a few items that are important to note from a functional perspective that are slightly related to that topic. So if you look at the orange fields that we have, so my new user-defined fields that I see in my data model, let's take, for example, this one, the Blazor ID. So the value or the name that was given to the user-defined field here is actually the code that was assigned to that user-defined field when you created it in Taleo. So it really means that someone created a UDF in Taleo in that zone and gave it a code of Blazor ID and then a label or also known as a description of whatever the description should be. So the reason that it's important to note is mainly for 3 things, right? Well, 2 things. The first one being that we need to know that it's the code that is showing into the zone here. The second one is, it is recommended to actually knowing that the code is what's going to be used as the name of the field in TCC. It's important to try to avoid any special characters. With the exception of underscore and the dash, maybe any other special character, although it might work well, is not recommended. I see an example right here where it says full name with Chinese in parentheses. We probably should have created that with an underscore, full underscore name underscore Chinese. Even spaces are actually, if you can, it's a good thing to avoid. The second thing that is important to note as well is that, post implementation, every time you're going to create a new UDF in your Taleo zone, most likely you'll create it in the staging environment first and then in production afterwards once you've completed your test. So what will be very important is that the code that you're going to give your UDF needs to be exactly the same in staging and in production. If there's a small difference, an underscore, so for example, if this was refreshed with the staging zone, for example, and in production, the UDF was created as Blazor underscore ID, it would mean that my script that I will build will actually work well when I'm in the staging zone, but it will then fail in production and say that the field does not exist. So it's going to be very important to make sure that your UDFs are exactly the same in staging and in production. Finally, note that whenever you run that synchronization, it's going to go and read your zone to see what are UDFs that needs to be added. So of course, if you create a new user-defined field and you want to use it in your integrations, but you've already synchronized your data model, you will need to resynchronize again if you want to see that new UDF in your data model. So it's not a one-time thing. Every time you create a new user-defined field, you'll need to resynchronize if you want to be able to use it in your integrations. So with that, it concludes this presentation on the synchronization of data models in TCC.